From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Chang-rae Lee emigrated to the United States from Korea in 1965 when he was just 3 years old. He attended some of the country's most prestigious schools, Phillips Exeter Academy and Yale, earned an MFA, and then, like most aspiring writers, he became a financial analyst on Wall Street. That, fortunately, did not last long, and soon he turned to fiction. His novels immediately attracted wide critical praise. Native Speaker and A Gesture Life are searching and powerful stories about the special challenges of immigrant life, the fragility of identity, and the burdens of memory. His work can be dark and very serious, as we see in his new novel, The Surrendered, or even comic and poignant, as we saw in his previous novel, Aloft. Now a professor of creative writing at Princeton University, Chang-rae Lee is a novelist who reminds us not only that we're a country of immigrants, but that the process of immigration is always more fraught and more complex than we imagined. Please join me in welcoming him.
Hi. It seems like I can never run away from that one brief year on Wall Street. I worked literally 365 days to the day, and I quit on that day so I could say to my father, I worked a year, and I'm going to quit now. But sometimes I get emails from friends and acquaintances from that time, and they always say, "Oh, it's great that you started writing books," and da 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 da, but they always, of course, say, "But you would have made a lot of money." I'd like to have 2 more zeros in my account, but that's okay. I was just going to talk a little bit about The Surrendered, a book that came out in the late spring. It's a book that I've been thinking about writing for a long time, and I guess I'll just say a few words, and I hope that people will ask questions, because I'd much rather respond to questions that you might have. But one of the questions I always get is about where stories come from for writers. People are always curious, and even people who know me well, sometimes look at me and think, "Why did you write that book, and where did that come from? What's wrong with you?" Or it's why that obsession? And there are lots of reasons. Sometimes it's stuff that I've been thinking about for a long time. Sometimes it's an accident. My second novel, I read an article in the newspaper about Korean comfort women, and I decided, boy, I can't believe I don't know about this, so I'm gonna look into it, and thus a novel came to be. But this particular novel, I've been thinking about writing it for a long, long time. It's a novel that takes place partly during the Korean War. Its main characters meet during the Korean War, and it follows their relationships and their struggles after the war. It's really a post-war novel rather than a war novel. But it's a book that, obviously, I'm Korean American, and I thought about writing a book about that time for a long time, ever since I became sort of, a writer in earnest. I guess I'm still a writer in earnest. And obviously, it's my background that spurred me on, and particularly my father and my mother's experience during the war. This was 1950, so they were young kids, about 11 and 12 years old. They never talked about their experience during the war. A lot of people, of their generation, never wanted to talk about the war, and still never want to talk about the war. So it was something that I didn't know about. It was, writers often write to fill in their questions, to satisfy some curiosity about a particular subject. And it was a particularly something that was important in my life. Back in college, I was taking a Korean history class, modern Korean history class, a seminar. And for that seminar, I had to write something about my family, a kind of autobiographical piece. And I ended up kind of cornering my father and asking him about his experience during the war. His family, just for a quick background, was from Pyongyang, which is now the capital of North Korea. And on the eve of hostilities, like many thousands of other refugees, they started to move southward to escape the fighting and to get to the south. So he told me a little bit about that time. It was the first time he'd ever talked about it. I was just kind of idly writing notes, not really thinking about what I might hear. He got into the story of how they moved southward, on foot, sometimes on trucks, and on this one particular night that he focused on, by a train. And if you think about it, it was a car, along many cars of a train, many train cars all put together, moving very slowly through dark countryside. He was actually on top of the train because there was no room inside the trains. These are cargo cars, not not passenger cars as we know them. So he and his family, and particularly he and his brother, were on top of this train, kind of balanced on top with lots of other refugees. And it turns out, of course, in my research, I found out that this was often the case. And one night, as they were trundling along at this low speed, the train hit something way up ahead. It lurched, and his younger brother, who was about 8 or 9 years old, fell off in between the cars. And unfortunately, his leg was amputated, and my father jumped down, and unfortunately his brother died of blood loss. It was an amazing story to hear, and my father really, probably devoted about 5 sentences to it. It was amazing to me to think of my father as someone who, my father's a psychiatrist, very mild-mannered, and someone who'd never, none of his actions or things he talked about, the way he conducted his life would ever betray that something like this had happened to him, which I thought was amazing. But of course, that story stayed with me, and for many years I thought, that would maybe be some kind of linchpin or something for a longer story. So I started this particular novel about 5 years ago, not writing about my father, but writing about 3 other characters. One character in particular, a young girl, a Korean girl named June, who at the start of this book begins a journey as my father did with her twin siblings. Again, as I mentioned, my father only described just a few things on that trip, so obviously I had to reinvent everything and elaborate to a great extent everything that happens in this book. And of course, as all books are, you bend details and you create things for the purpose of the book, not so much worrying about what happens in real life. And so this is a book that in some ways was galvanized by that experience. And that experience was the spark of it. So what I thought I'd do is I'll just read the first page or 2 about it, just to give you a sense of how it sounds, because I always believe that prose should sound like something that the writer wants it to sound like. It's not just about storytelling. It's not just about showing you what's happened. And then I'd love to hear some, questions from you about really anything you'd like. Korea, 1950. The journey was nearly over. The night was unusually chilly, the wind sharpened by the speed of the train as it rolled southward through the darkened valley. The cotton blanket June had stolen was large enough to spread as a tarp and at the same time wrap around her younger brother and sister and herself. But it was threadbare, and for brief stretches the train would accelerate and the wind would cut right through to them. It had not been a problem the night before, but now they were riding on top of the boxcar, as there was no more room within any of them, even as the train was more than a dozen cars long. A massive phalanx of refugees had met the train at the last station, and in the time it took her siblings to relieve themselves by the side of the tracks, they had lost their place and had had to climb the rusted ladder between the cars, June running alongside for 50 meters until her brother was high enough on the rungs so she herself could jump up and on. There was a score or so of people atop every car, groupings of families and neighbors, mostly women and the old and the young, and then a cluster or 2 like theirs, children traveling by themselves. June was 11. Hisu and Jiyoung had just turned 7. They were fraternal twins, though looked as much alike as a sister and brother could, only the cut of their hair distinguishing them. June knew they could have waited in the hope of another train with room inside, but it hadn't been cold when they stopped just before dusk, and she decided they ought to keep moving while they had the chance. To keep moving was always safer than lingering in one place, and there was nothing back at the depot to eat anyway. There were a few scruffy soldiers drinking and playing cards by the depot shack, though their presence could only mean trouble, even for a girl her age. She was tall besides, and she was wary of soldiers and any stray men. They were some 200 kilometers south of Seoul, past Jeongju, and June was now thinking that they would make their way down to Busan, where her uncle's family lived, though she didn't know whether they were still there or even alive. The train sped up on a slight decline, and June curled her arm around her siblings, spooning them tightly. They lay as low as they could between the ridges of the steel roof of the boxcar. They were on the front end of the car, and as such, they were fully buffeted by the rushing wind. They were fortunate to have a blanket. Many others on top of the cars did not. It was too early to sleep, but it was cold, and it was better for the twins not to be active, especially given that the two had shared only a few crackers early in the day. June herself had eaten nothing. They had eaten well the day before, as June had found below a footbridge a GI's abandoned pack of canned rations, a small bar of chocolate, and a sleeve of crackers. Her brother and sister were so hungry that they'd bolted down the chocolate first as June was smashing the cans open against a rock. She'd cut her finger and gotten some blood on the food, but they ate it without hesitation, 2 tins of stewed beef and one of sardines and tomato sauce. Afterward, each taking a turn to lick the insides carefully with the deftness of cats. She made them save the crackers. They'd been by themselves on the road since their mother and older sister were killed 2 weeks before, at first traveling with some people from their town, but then blending in with the endless stream of other refugees moving southward along the pushed-up roads and embankments of the river valleys. At another time, it might have been a pretty journey, the hills just turning the colors of pumpkin and hay and pomegranate, and the skies depthless and clear. But now, everywhere one looked, most of the trees had been felled for fuel, and there was only a hazy, oppressive brightness refracted from the shorn hillsides. There were formerly cultivated fields of potatoes and cabbages, and then the terraces of rice paddies, but all had been stripped and then abandoned during these first months of the war. I'll stop there, thanks. As I said, the first chapter then goes on, and we follow the lives of the other characters. But enough about me and this book. I hope that you have a question, sir.
Hi, could you please talk a little bit about your writing process and your daily routines when you're working on a manuscript?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my writing process is a very ordinary one. I really treat it like a job. You know, I have young girls, 9 and 13, and so, I help get them together for school. I make breakfast. One of us will take them out to the bus, and then at about 8:30 or 8 o'clock or so, I sit at my desk and work till lunch. And lunch, as I said with someone else, is very important. If I don't know that I'm going to have a good lunch, or I don't know what's going to be there for lunch, I have a lot of trouble writing, actually. So that's sort of the beacon, that's pinging at the end of that long morning. And then after lunch, you have a little bit of lunch coma. So I'll rest a little bit, maybe listen to some music, read, and then work a couple hours until the girls come home, and then it's over. But it's I'm a very slow writer. I don't know why that is. I wish I could be like some other writers who could just toss off 1,000 words in a morning and like them, but I just can't do that. So it's pretty painstaking, and I must say it's difficult work. It's very difficult work, and I always distrust people who say it's not difficult work, especially my students who say that. Yes.
I saw that you were an English major, and with your story of your father, I wonder if he approved of that. And when did you first know that you wanted to be a writer as a way of making your living, and when did you start thinking of yourself really as a writer?
Well, I don't. It took me a long time to think of really to accept the fact that this is really what I want to do for a living, you know. And obviously, I quit my job because I thought that I should give myself a chance at doing so. But well before that, in high school, you know, I had some great English teachers, and I always loved books. I always loved reading. I hung out at the library a lot as a kid. And you know, if you're someone who, yeah, if you're someone who's you know, who loves to read, at some point I think you wonder, well, could I give this experience to someone else? You know, could I craft this language of the story, create these characters? And you just wonder that. And you know, I started doing a little bit of that in high school and really enjoying it. But you know, part of my background, because my folks are, you know, we were all immigrants, and we didn't really have a safety net here. We didn't have any other relatives, and you know, my parents sent me to these nice, expensive schools. I never thought that it would actually be something I did for a living. And it, you know, it wasn't, you know, my parents didn't come here to have their son become an artist or a writer, right? It's honorable, but obviously it's not something that's bankable. So I think it took me just a long time to disabuse myself of that notion that you know, that I could do this, and or that I should try to honor what I really did want to do. Yeah.
So when did you actually really think of yourself as a writer?
Probably after my first novel was published. And then I thought, you know, and regardless of what people thought of it, I thought, you know, I did absolutely, I didn't enjoy the process because, as I said, writing is sometimes tortuous, but I got a lot of, you know, a sense of fulfillment out of that, yeah.
I was wondering, I'm an East Asian Studies major, and a lot of times Korean Americans are referred to as a model minority, and that they go to great schools like Yale and then
It
get
does them
great
no
jobs
good, though.
such as yourself. And I was wondering about perhaps maybe Korean nationals would look at your life and feel envious or seem, I mean, it seems like you've, sorry, I'm inarticulate.
Yeah,
but you've had this really ideal life, and I'm wondering how they feel about you writing about this incredible suffering, this like Korean national suffering.
Well, I don't know yet. The book has not appeared in Korea yet, this book, so I don't know yet how they feel. But you know, I think it's a myth too. I mean, I think a lot of Korean Americans, and I know that because I get lots of notices from philanthropic groups about Korean Americans who are struggling, and you know, so I think that's a myth about you know, Korean Americans doing so well and all of us doing so well. And then of course, you know, it's like anything else, you know, everyone's different, and what seems well, that someone's doing well on the outside might actually not be, you know, so great. So
Nationals would be receptive to an American telling their story in that way?
I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. I hope so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
안녕하세요. Would you compare, or how would you compare your fiction with that of Richard Kim, who wrote The Martyred and the Innocent?
Well, you know, those are wonderful novels. I think my fiction is perhaps more interested in its own language, more than Mr. Kim's books were. The beauty of his language is a kind of spareness, and it's often a directness that is kind of startling, and I think that's what's wonderful about his writing. I think my books, in this book, maybe less so than my previous three, tend to be a little conscious of their own storytelling modes. So I think they much more are about their own language than also just strictly and discreetly that story.
Hi. Can you tell me who your favorite writers are and how they may have helped you find your own writing voice?
I have so many favorite writers, but I suppose I could mention a few when I was, say, in 7th and 8th and ninth grade, when I was really, and maybe they're more particular books than anything else. And I mentioned just those a couple minutes ago. James Joyce's collection, The Dubliners, I thought was such a beautiful collection, and up until that point, I hadn't had a real sensitivity to language in a prose fiction, and I did then. Some of Ernest Hemingway's stories, particularly some of his in the collection In Our Time, little vignettes of wartime, and I thought those were really harrowing, but had a beautiful spark to them. So those are some writers that, I'd always been attracted to writers, and when you're reading them or you're reading a particular work, where you feel it's almost that you're not even holding a book anymore, that something else has happened, that you have this, very corporal, bodily, somatic experience. All the intellectual stuff is there, all the symbolic and spiritual stuff is there, but ultimately it's a physical thing, because it's an emotional thing, and those are certain moments that I felt that. Yeah.
How are you?
Great.
You mentioned before your work with the writing on and researching the comfort women, and I used to live in Seoul, where I was involved in the reparations movement on behalf of the comfort women, and I think it's a really powerful issue. And I was wondering if you could speak to your role in either researching or using writing as a tool of empowerment on behalf of women who have experienced sexual slavery.
Well, for that book, novel is called A Gesture Life, and I did do a lot of research for that book, and one of the great moments of research in my writing experience was going over to Seoul and meeting with I would say about a dozen of the women survivors who were living in a house together. The house was donated to them by some Buddhist monks.
The Nanumechi.
Yeah, and this was probably in 1995 or so that I went over there. Pretty early on in all the hubbub about it. After it was revealed that this had happened, and it was a great day, and those are some of the moments that where research really just comes alive and is vital, and just sitting with these women and seeing their faces and seeing all their differences, that they were individuals, they're not just all victims, right? And things were perpetrated on them, but they had all these different histories and psychologies, and that was very instructive. I had to remember that I wasn't writing history. I'm writing a novel, which is an entirely different thing, and I think that's why novels are important still. I hope. I mean, history is one thing, and it's important to know, but a novel can give you an intimate, secret history that maybe no one wants to look at, and that isn't always so patent or black and white. Maybe it isn't even all that glorious, but it's very human. Thank you. Yeah.
Is it on? How do you manage when you're writing about war and children dying and things that are very difficult? How do you manage every day to go back and forth between the world that you're creating that's so sad and tragic, and then, I don't know, taking your kids to soccer practice or something like that?
That's a good question. Sometimes it was hard. Sometimes you need something called Pinot Noir. Sometimes, but it is kind of hard. This book, unlike my previous three, I did have a little bit of difficulty transitioning back and forth. I'd come downstairs and I would just sort of sit there. And my wife would say, what happened? I'd say, I don't know what happened. I can't, I don't know what happened. So.
Does it make it difficult in the morning sometimes to go back to that world?
Yeah, every morning, I tell you, every morning is, and I remember reading this about John Updike. He said that every morning he'd look at the paper and make all these excuses why he wouldn't go upstairs. Mm-hmm. And I know exactly that feeling. You know, I read every word of the paper. Because because you know you're going to get into stuff, and that not that it's just difficult or unhappy or sad, but that you're going to have to really work it. You know, it's so frustrating sometimes. So, yeah. Thank you for your question. 2 minutes.
Do you feel like you've been labeled as an Asian American author, and will this restrict what your subject matter will be and what you can write about?
Well, I don't think it doesn't restrict me. I hope one of the things I worry about is that say one of you would see my name on this book, say, and just naturally think, that's sort of a foreign name, and I don't, not that you're racist or anything, but that you might just literally say, you know what, it doesn't speak to me in a certain, I don't know, way. And that you might assume also that it's really a book only for Asian Americans or Korean Americans. And, that's something that I absolutely wouldn't want to have. I mean, I would want Korean Americans or Asian Americans to look at my work and really be moved by it and think, yes, he's connected with something there. But if a non-Asian person, were to read my books and think, I want them to have the same feeling. So it's more about reader expectations than what limits. I'm not limited because, that's why I write. I mean, writing is about liberty in the end.
Yeah, I just want to say I do feel bonded to you by your name and by your ethnicity. Thank you.
Thank you.
I love to read books about people who come from different cultures and countries. And I've read a great many by Chinese American writers, but there haven't been very many about Korean Americans.
Actually, there have been.
Well, that I'm not aware of. There may have been some that are not as well known. So I just wanted to say I'm very happy that you're writing, because I'm interested in learning more about the Korean culture. There's also a new book out called The Calligrapher's Daughter by Eugenia Kim, and that gives another picture of life growing up in Korea that was very interesting.
All right. Thank you. Okay, well, thanks a lot.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.